Ага. Ага.
Зараз.
Я тебе щось не чую.
Почекай. Та не виходить. Що?
Ага.
Да, все вийшло. Давай.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Looks like there's a bit of a delay, so I guess that we will be getting started just a little bit late today. Welcome to all of you on the podcast, attending the third lecture on an academic perspective of corruption. Today we'll be talking about just some of the impact that corruption has on different aspects of society. We'll be looking at it from several different angles, including both economic and non-economic factors, as well as through human rights. We won't be able to look at all of the different impacts just due to the overall complexity of the issue, as well as the limited amount of time that we have to conduct today's webinar. So anyway, today we're talking about corruption's impact, today on the 20th. Next week I will not be here on Thursday, so there won't be a webinar. The next webinar on corruption as it relates to different types of government will be on the 3rd of next month. So 2 weeks until the next lesson, the next lecture, the next webinar. So just a word of caution. Hopefully you'll all be there, and hopefully you'll enjoy this one and be willing to wait an extra week for me for the next lesson. So when we look at corruption, this is a very, very simplified method, a very simplified view of corruption here. There's obviously many different types of corruption, but there are two generalized corrupt systems. The first is a centralized system. A very strong leader organizes all corruption and determines everyone's take. Obviously, this requires a very strong leader, and this person has to have what's called a long time horizon. People who stand to be in power for very long periods of time and not have to risk after the first few months or the beginning of their ascension rivals rising up to seize the state for a very long period of time. We'll be looking at one of those examples today in Zaire. We looked at Suharto's Indonesia. We can also look at the stable situation of the Soviet Union, where corruption, like in Suharto's Indonesia, was very state-controlled. Everyone received a certain cut, and as you moved up the ladder, you got a bigger cut. And then there's a decentralized system, which has many bribe takers. Basically, that situation arises from no leader being powerful enough to organize every element, to really bring all of the state systems of control under themselves. They have what's called a short time horizon, and they tend to look at accumulating as much wealth as they can over a very short period of time, because they know that the next person, the next usurper, will be there to take their position as quickly as possible. They may also be beholden to outgoing corrupt leadership, which we see in we'll look at a little bit later as well in regards to Zaire, where they switched from long-term horizon to short-term horizon. And then some examples of that: Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and a lot of post-Soviet Union Eastern Europe. Directly after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, where governments hadn't had the chance to properly organize themselves following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these are, in general, the two types of corrupt systems, the very, very generalized systems of corruption. So first I wanted to get that out of the way so that you have a better understanding of the main structure of corruption's impact. Because the impact of these two systems affect corruption in very, very different ways. So the first impact of corruption that we're going to look at today is the economic impact of corruption. So some of them, and there are a few more after this: loss of foreign direct investment, rise of inflation, capital flight, loss of economic growth, increased unemployment, lower purchasing power, increased cost of products, reduced efficiencies, so a lot of government waste. This was a big problem in Greece. When we reach their financial bailout, we'll talk about them a little bit more later on. They would have, I was reading articles of Greek teachers without students because Greek politicians would promise jobs in exchange for votes to different regions. And then a lower productivity and a lower standard of living. And we'll see that really come into effect when we talk about Zaire a little bit later on. But I want to go into further detail in some of the other areas of economic impact. And not to minimize these, foreign direct investment specifically is hugely important for many, many countries. It's a big loss when you have issues of corruption that really can significantly reduce foreign direct investment mainly because the court systems, and again we'll look at this, we'll see this a little later on, is not strong enough to uphold contracts. So you see a lot of these capital flight is a major problem. We saw that recently with the big dump of offshore account holdings, led to the resignation of the Prime Minister of Iceland, had impact in all over the world of Monsanto, I believe it was called, holding people's, the Panama Papers, holding people's offshore accounts, Lionel Messi, and other wealthy people. So when we get into economic impact, one of the big areas that we'll look at is reduced government revenue and debt. The Greek financial situation, the Greek bailout, has been a major topic of conversation for several years now. And really that came about due to several factors. I'm not an economist, but what we really look at is Greek politicians basically bribing constituents with tangible results, such as jobs, even when those jobs aren't necessary for the situation that they're in. The Greeks have two major terms, and if there are any Greek people listening and I butcher these words, I apologize. Fakalaki, or little envelopes, bribes that affect everyone from hospital patients to fishmongers. Basically the little bribes that people pay, maybe to a police officer to get out of a ticket, to someone working at the DMV to speed through your license. And then there's rozfeti, meaning expensive political favors. So which can be hiring teachers, large deals to hiring teachers, to dealing with Greek Orthodox monks, and the fact that many religious properties, buildings, aren't taxed. And that's not just the case in Greece, but throughout the world. Many of the religious institutions exist tax-free. Bribery, patronage, and other public corruptions are major contributors to the country's ballooning debt. And estimates have placed the value of that at 8% of GDP, which is more than $27 billion, or 20 billion euros, potentially lost every year as a result of this type of corruption. You have numerous other issues that faced Greece when they joined the euro. Their credit rating skyrocketed all the way up to the top level, I believe A+, which was a jump from, I believe they were at C. So borrowing became significantly cheaper. And what you see with a lot of corrupt governments, and I'm not saying that Greece's government was entirely corrupt. However, what you see in general with corrupt governments is an overall willingness to borrow as much as possible, as quickly as possible. That deals with the short-term horizons. Borrowing can be stolen very quickly, and then payment of borrowing then becomes somebody else's problem, because at that point you are long gone. You'll see this all comes from the Wall Street Journal report in 2010. Greece has undergone quite a bit of change since then, but we can really see the skyrocketing debt, and you'll see that many very corrupt countries experience this this quick rise in borrowing and in overall debt. We can see this in a little more detail when we look at deficit versus corruption. And as you can see, Greece and Italy tended to be more corrupt. However, Italy hasn't fallen into the same overall level. But in general, in spite of the U.S. and Portugal, what you generally see is the more corrupt a society, the more debt they have. And this is of major countries, Western countries, but you'll see this in dictatorships across Southeast Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Latin America. The more corrupt the government, the higher the borrowing, and the more debt that they take on. You look at the United States, can be kind of viewed through a different lens in terms of U.S. responsibilities and engagements on a global scale, which is unlike any other country in the world at this time. One other big aspect that we see is income disparity. Income inequality is a major issue for most countries that are very corrupt. Now, the rankings here, the Gini ratings are an overall income inequality score, which is compiled by multiple different agencies, do their own Gini scores. This is from the UN Human Development Reports. Palma is another score that goes from 0 to 10. The higher the score, the more income inequality there tends to be. So I put Ukraine in there as well as the corruption percentage index rating. You'll see a general correlation between the top and bottom, between the lower the Gini rating, typically the lower the corruption score. The higher the Gini rating, the higher the corruption score. And income inequality tends to really display itself in corruption, in corrupt countries, as the smaller group of people are required to keep the citizenry in line. And the smaller the group of people, the more money they make, and the larger the disparity tends to be between the wealthy and the poor. So economic impact is, of course, only one impact of corruption that corruption tends to have on a society. What we're really going to look at now is the non-economic impacts of corruption. This is where you can have an even greater effect than the economic impact is through the non-economic impact. And there are also a lot more impacts. A generalized decrease in population, which goes along with brain drain, which is a continual concern for corrupt governments, as they tend to not pay their employees as much as less corrupt countries. Everything goes towards reinforcing corruption, as corruption breeds more corruption, and the reduced bureaucratic efficiency leads to corruption reinforcing itself, because that's where all of the money is. Misallocation of investment. So tends to be an increase in, oddly enough, well, not oddly enough, but an increase in infrastructure, a decrease in education, and a decrease in healthcare. And the reason for this is money within infrastructure, as well as defense spending, is very opaque and easily stolen. There's typically a decrease in education, most often in higher education. Dictatorial leaders like subjects who are just educated enough to do basic work, but not educated enough to really question the system. So, you look at all of these things. Donor fatigue. Donors quickly get tired of dealing with governments that don't produce results for their money. But again, with a short-term horizon, you may have quicker government turnover, and donors may be more willing to engage with a new government, as new governments usually come in with promises of things, among others, fighting corruption. We talked a little bit about brain drain, the best and brightest leaving, environmental degradation. Everything goes towards making as much money as you can, as quickly as you can, and everything else is thrown by the wayside. We reduce considerations of fairness and merit. This was a big issue at first with Barack Obama and his choice of U.S. ambassadors. Not all U.S. ambassadors. However, some would. I remember watching hearings for their Senate confirmation hearings, and ministers, I've never been to this country, I don't know anything about this country, but they tended to be people who donated a lot of money to his campaign. And then we see it again with the Trump administration, and bringing on some of his cabinet members who are very large donors to the Republican Party. This is by no means a one-off situation only in more corrupt countries. But in more corrupt countries, you'll see jobs for sale, especially jobs that offer the highest opportunity for corruption. Import-export officials will typically pay to get that job because they know that they can extract large amounts of money in the form of bribes. But let's look at some other issues of non-economic impact in some more detail. So the rise of organized crime and people taking the law into their own hands. Italy has a very long, very in-depth history when it comes to corruption. Really what we want to start off with is looking all the way back to ancient Rome, and then we'll get into modern Italy today. And again, when you look at a country like Italy, there's so much detail and so much depth that it requires a fantastic amount of research, far more than you'll get within this short presentation that I'm giving today. But the Republic, the Roman Republic, was often based on patronage. Politicians bribing people for votes, giving them food, giving them jobs, providing them with the necessities of life. And that was a very standard part of the Roman electoral process. Wealthy elites buying votes. Now, what took an interesting turn was that the generals of the Roman Republic soon started getting involved in politics. Typically, Roman generals came from the elite anyway, but what we would see is Roman soldiers becoming more and more loyal, not to the Roman state, but to the generals themselves, who would provide them with any number of different economic opportunities, including slaves, lands, wealth, etc. So what would happen was, when a Roman army would go conquer somewhere, they would consumed the wealth of the region. Part of the reason Caesar became so wealthy was his conquest of Gaul. And we would see these generals become more and more powerful as Rome grew more and more powerful. And it just spilled into a larger and larger and larger, the civil wars and the struggles for power became larger and more unwieldy as the elites became wealthier. So not to say that Roman politicians at the beginning of the Republic were any more moral or less inclined towards corruption. However, when you bring the wealth of vast regions under your control, which we saw in the which, if you research the history of Pompey and Caesar, they're bringing massive, massive sums of wealth through the regions that they control and have conquered. The other thing that would happen, which also helped to tear apart the Roman Republic, was that soldiers would resort to violence because they were able to vote. And politicians would hire gangs of people or retired soldiers to push through laws that were voted on by Roman citizens. Caesar was really an expert at this, of hiring gangs of thugs to control the streets. And as these politicians became wealthier and wealthier, they really just consumed the Republic. And this was all through the immense system of patronage that existed throughout the Roman Republic from its beginning until its ultimate end under the Roman Imperium with Caesar and later Augustus. But this was a common situation. It would even continue under the Imperium as emperors would bribe the Praetorian Guard, the direct protectors of the Roman Emperor, every time a new emperor came to power, because the Praetorians became such a political force. So corruption goes way, way back. Today, when you look at modern Italy, mafia-type Italian organized crime is not just considered a threat to Italy itself, but is considered a threat to the entire European Union. I pulled all of this from an Interpol report outlining the threat faced by different types of organizations. The mafias are so well ingrained in Italy and throughout Europe as well. They're capable of manipulating elections, installing their men into administrative positions, even not just in Italy, but across Europe as well. They take part in many common corrupt activities: racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, protection money, etc. And what the report details is that they've taken complete control, not just of the area itself, but the atmosphere of the area. There's the people are more inclined to obey the mafia than the state. And the mafia has actually reached across the globe, not just in countries like Spain, France, and Germany, in the European Union, where it is truly the biggest threat is in the European Union. But you can look at it reaching all the way to the United States and Canada, Venezuela, South Africa, Eastern Europe, Albania, Colombia, and even all the way to Australia. The Italian mafia has their ties, excuse me. And these are organizations that exist through the prism of the state not being trusted by their people, and leaving that leaving that open to the rest of to other organizations and other actors within society. So if there's time, there's Lilia, I'll get back to the income disparity table. If you have access to as all of you do, to review the presentation later on, the links are there for you to review it in more detail. So One of the other major risks when it comes to the impact of corruption is that corruption was a central enabling factor in every case of nuclear proliferation, and it will remain that way as everything goes, as the world progresses. India and Pakistan were well known for stealing nuclear secrets, which led to their creation of nuclear weapons. Israel has an unconfirmed nuclear arsenal, which is claimed to have been gotten through both legitimate and corrupt methodologies. Every country that has nuclear weapons, except for maybe just the United States, even the Soviet Union stole certain nuclear weapons information and technology from the United States to build their nuclear stockpiles, their nuclear weapons. But to look at a couple more specifically, Pakistan is a premier exporter. They supply centrifuges and other key forms of technology. They've provided it to Iran, Iraq, Libya, and North Korea at the very least. Pakistan represents a very corrupt country with a number of corrupt players. The story that I read further went on to say that two former Pakistani generals sold uranium enrichment technology to North Korea in return for millions of dollars in cash and jewels, handed over in canvas bags and cardboard boxes of fruit. When you have corrupt countries with nuclear capabilities, there's little to prevent them from selling to potentially terror organizations, ISIS, Al Qaeda, even white supremacist movements. The issue is that as this technology has become and fallen into particularly corrupt states, North Korea, Pakistan, India faces severe issues of corruption, which isn't to say anything about Britain, France, and the United States potentially providing the secrets to countries. You face a real threat of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear technologies. Iraq at one point convinced a Yugoslav firm to build facilities in Baghdad, producing 15 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium per year. They originally tried in the early 80s. Israel destroyed their facility, which led to the Iranian facilities being deep underground and under much more military control. But what you see is Iraq's buildup of nuclear weapons, and just before Saddam Hussein's ouster, he was about to start a crash program where he would steal the weapons-grade uranium from the facilities that had been set up by French and Italian firms within Iraq. And fortunately, he was overthrown before that could take place. But it just presents the risks of nuclear trading and nuclear technology through corruption. And if you're willing to take the money, almost anyone will have full access to this kind of technology. Further, as you get to corruption, there's a direct link between terrorism and corruption. Higher levels of corruption in a country increase the number of terror attacks that originate in that country. 9/11 was predominantly originated in Saudi Arabia, a country with very low corruption ratings. Pakistan, a country with very high levels of corruption and very high numbers of terror attacks. Afghanistan. It's not the case everywhere. You'll see that in China, which has very high corruption ratings. However, very controlled, organized state, very centralized corruption. Pakistan, Afghanistan, not nearly as centralized. But China really put a clamp down on a lot of this. Is a very, very controlled state. Nation states that facilitate illicit trafficking of all kinds produce heightened number of terrorist attacks. So countries that take part in trafficking, be it people, drugs, weapons, face heightened numbers of terrorist attacks. What corruption allows is for these illegal groups to formulate pipelines and methods for